Thing that was memorable for me in Mr. Burns was the fact that they performed commercials in the second act because everybody who watches TV hates commercials, but it gave all the characters a sense of the world pre-apocalypse. So I thought that was definitely interesting. Two, three prominent themes. The first, I think, is storytelling. The truth lives on through stories. So, like, I'm Jewish, and my ancestors and my family has always tell me, like, tell the story of the Holocaust to your kids and make sure they tell it to their kids. And, they taught us that through Hebrew school because the truth does live on through stories. But it also depends on how you do tell the story because by Act 3, 75 years after the apocalypse, it was so different that Sideshow Bob wasn't even Sideshow Bob anymore. He was Mr. Burns, which actually brings me to my second theme, which was nostalgia. So, like, in the first act, they're holding on so tightly to this episode of The Simpsons because that's what they still have and that's what they still remember. And they worked so hard to piece it together. And in Act 2, it becomes their entire world simply because it reminds them of their past and it's familiar. So I think that's another reason Sideshow Bob morphed into Mr. Burns because it was familiar and the characters were nostalgic for life pre-apocalypse. And then the third theme I said was coping and coping mechanisms. Everybody copes differently. In the beginning, in the woods, Colleen was kind of alone all by herself and everyone wanted to stick together and stuff. But then in Act 2, Colleen was literally the director of the episode of The Simpsons they were trying to put on, and she totally dove into her work and was like completely immersed in that, and it took over her life. And I think that was interesting. What kind of play was this? Act 3, I would say, was definitely avant-garde. It was strangely interesting. There wasn't really a consecutive storyline present, and it definitely had spectacle qualities. There were musical performances, there were crazy lights and costumes, and what makes it really avant-garde is that it was almost unrecognizable. The characters that we knew from The Simpsons almost took on a new form, and avant-garde is all about like experimentation, stuff like that. So three connections from Act 3 to the previous acts in the play were on page 112, Itchy and Scratchy first come on, and that was cute because those were the characters in the television show in the Simpsons episode that Lisa and Bart were watching originally. In Act 2, on page 89, Maria says, was toxic in or out did we decide? And on Act 3, page 120, the actors actually do sing Toxic, so that's 75 years later, so that I thought was definitely interesting. And then number 3 on page 122, when Bart sings, it literally says, in italicized font, the song recalls from the high point of the second act melody, so they're literally taking it from, it's in the stage direction, so that was a good comparison. And then number 4, what are some pop culture stories that could live on post-apocalypse? I guess social media. In our world today, we're so obsessed with social media and how people perceive us. And I would imagine a non-virtual social media would take over post-apocalypse life. Like maybe you would create a real wall, like on Facebook, to represent yourself and write down everything you're doing and stuff. It would definitely help people cope with the transition of not having electronics and not having a plug into the world. So I think that could definitely still happen. People are always going to be thirsty for other people's reactions and blessings and stuff like that. So I think social media is definitely something that could continue post-apocalypse life.